Two tiny German Shepherd puppies hung from the handle of a trash bin in a frozen Denver alley, their paws tied, their mouths bound, trembling as winter wind cut through the dark. They had been thrown away, left to freeze in silence. Miles away, a 42-year-old veteran in a worn green coat drove through the storm, carrying memories he wished he could outrun. He wasn't looking for anyone, but the faint, muffled cries pulled him back to the man he once was, a protector. And in rescuing them, he took his first step toward healing the silent wounds he carried. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. A winter storm gripped Denver, burying streets beneath a hard white silence as wind clawed along the empty blocks. Ethan Cole, a 42-year-old veteran with a frame carved by years of discipline and regret, guided his aging pickup truck through the swirling haze. He wore a faded green coat, whose frayed cuffs carried the faint smell of machine oil and distant deserts. His face, angular, weather-beaten, lined deeply at the eyes, belonged to a man who had spent too long fighting enemies he could no longer name. Stubble shadowed his jaw, coarse and uneven, as though he shaved only when memory permitted him the softness. His eyes, a pale storm gray, had once held clarity and purpose. Now they dulled beneath burdens that never left him, even in sleep. The road offered him no destination tonight. It was simply motion, something that kept his mind from folding in on itself. The war had ended for him years ago, yet it walked beside him like an old ghost, whispering at the edges of the quiet. Denver's winter only amplified the emptiness inside him. Every breath he drew in the frozen air and scraped his chest, like a reminder of the things he had survived and the things he couldn't forget. When he turned down the narrow lane behind a small grocery store, the noise of his tires crunching on ice was swallowed by the wind, until he heard it. A sound so faint he wasn't sure it was real. Not a clean cry, not a bark, not even a whimper. Rather the muffled, strangled vibration of something alive trying desperately to be heard. Ethan killed the engine, and the silence that followed was heavy, almost accusatory. His pulse ticked up in his throat. Years of military training wired him to investigate, even when he feared what he might find. He stepped out, boots sinking into cold drifts, and lifted his flashlight. The beam trembled along a brick wall crusted with frost. The noise came again, quicker, more desperate. Following it, Ethan approached a large green dumpster wedged between the buildings. His breath caught as the light fell upon two tiny forms dangling from the dumpster's metal handle. They were German Shepherd puppies, hardly older than a month. Their fur was glued with ice, their paws cinched cruelly with rope, their small muzzles bound tight with filthy cloth. Their bodies twitched in cold spasms, and their eyes, huge, glossy, terrified, stared directly into Ethan's as though begging him not to walk away. Rage and sorrow crashed into him at once. These weren't just puppies. They were helpless things the world had decided were disposable, and the sight of them, struggling silently, suspended like broken toys, hit something raw inside him. A part of him remembered carrying wounded men through dust and gunfire, hearing their breathing slip away in his arms. A part of him remembered failing. "No, no, no, no," he whispered, voice cracking as he stepped forward. His fingers worked quickly despite the cold. The ropes were stiff, frozen, nearly solid. When he touched the puppies' trembling bodies, they flinched, but couldn't cry. "Easy," he murmured, though his own heart hammered painfully. "I've got you now." The moment the cloth was loosened from their muzzles, one puppy let out the softest, broken whine, a sound so fragile that Ethan's throat closed. He cradled them both against his chest, tucking them beneath his green coat, feeling their skeletal weight press into him. Their fur was so cold it burned his skin. "You're safe," he whispered, unsure if he said it to them or to the wounded part of himself that still believed in rescue. Footsteps crunched at the mouth of the alley. Ethan spun, shielding the puppies instinctively, but the figure that emerged was small and unthreatening, wrapped in a long gray overcoat that fluttered in the wind. A young woman, slender, pale-faced, her chestnut brown hair tucked beneath a knitted hat. She held a white cane, tapping gently through the snow. Her name was Grace Miller. She looked no more than 27, with delicate features and calm, unfocused eyes that drifted slightly upward, eyes that revealed her blindness even before the cane did. Her movements were gentle and deliberate, as though she listened her way through the world rather than moved through it. She worked at the Denver Animal Rescue Center, a quiet soul whose life revolved around creatures no one else bothered to see. "Is someone there?" she called softly, her voice warm despite the cold, trembling just enough to reveal she was afraid of disturbing what she could not see. Ethan hesitated, the weight of the puppies still in his arms. "Yeah," he answered. "2 dogs. Someone left them like this." Grace drew a slow breath, the kind that pulled pain inward. She tapped her cane forward until its tip brushed Ethan's boot. "Are they alive?" "Barely," he said, tightening his coat around them. Grace moved closer, close enough for him to see the faint freckles on her cheeks and the soft tremor in her lips from the cold. Though blind, she tilted her head as if trying to sense the shape of the suffering in front of her. "I heard their cries," she whispered, "even from the sidewalk. Sometimes I hear things people with sight overlook." Ethan swallowed hard. The wind howled around them, but for a moment, the alley felt suspended in silence. Just a broken man, a blind woman, and 2 tiny lives hanging by a thread. Grace reached out her hand, not to touch the puppies, but to steady herself. "Thank you for finding them," she said. "Most people would have kept walking." Ethan looked at her, surprised at the quiet conviction in her voice. "I didn't find them," he murmured. "They found me." Grace nodded, as though she understood something deeper than the words themselves. And in that instant, snow swirling, wind tearing at their coats, Ethan Cole felt the smallest shift within himself, a thread of purpose tugging him out of the darkness he'd been living in. 2 puppies clung to life in his arms. A blind woman stood brave in the storm. And none of them yet knew that this frozen alley in Denver was the beginning of a path that would change all their lives. Snow hammered the outskirts of Denver as Ethan Cole pushed open the warped wooden door of the old cabin he had been calling home. The structure leaned slightly downhill, as if exhausted from decades of storms. Yet it remained standing, much like the man who stepped inside. The warmth was non-existent. Air hung still and bitter. But the stone fireplace at the center of the single-room dwelling, cracked yet functional, waited like an old friend capable of one more service. Ethan moved with urgent care, holding the 2 frail puppies wrapped beneath his faded green coat. Max, the stronger one, stirred in tiny, stuttering breaths, his fur still stiff with ice. Luna, smaller, weaker, her coat marked by a faint pale patch on her chest, barely moved at all. Her breaths were shallow clouds fading into the dim air. Ethan gently lowered them onto an old wool blanket positioned before the hearth. Knees cracking as he knelt, he tugged off his gloves and reached for the stack of wood he had chopped earlier that week. His fingers, usually steady from years of forced discipline, shook as he struck a match, the flame blooming to life with a soft hiss. Soon the fire caught, throwing warm orange light across the uneven walls. Shadows flickered like restless ghosts around him. With careful hands, Ethan loosened the filthy cloth still hanging at their muzzles, whispering apologies even though he knew they could not understand the words, only the tone. His military knife, worn smooth from years in combat zones, sliced the stiff ropes binding their legs. The moment their paws were free, Max let out a tiny, pitiful sound, half whimper, half plea, and pressed his cold nose into Ethan's palm. Luna didn't move at first, her body limp in a way that made dread climb up Ethan's spine. "Come on, sweetheart," he murmured, cupping her tiny form between his palms and rubbing gently, trying to coax warmth into her bones. "Stay with me." He reached into a cupboard near the sink where he stored emergency supplies, mostly canned food, ration bars, and instant coffee. He tore a ration bar into pieces, soaked them in warm water from his canteen, and brought the softened bits to the pups. Max licked clumsily, his little tongue weak but determined. Luna only made a faint sound, turning her face slightly, as if her body wasn't sure whether to keep fighting. Ethan drew her closer to the fire, lifting her tiny head with his fingertips. Her fur was softer than expected under all the ice, a light-hearted reminder she was still alive. He wet his thumb in the warm water and let a droplet fall on her lips. After a tense moment, she licked it. Relief washed through Ethan like thawing ice. "Good girl," he whispered, feeling a knot in his chest loosen. He had seen enough death, on battlefields and in the quiet corners of Denver's forgotten streets. He refused to let it take anything else tonight. As he worked, the storm outside intensified, snow slapping the roof into a saison, wild bursts. The cabin creaked as if protesting the cold. Ethan pulled the blanket closer around the puppies, using his own coat as an extra layer. The fire crackled, warming the room with its slow-growing breath. Only then, when the puppies' trembling eased even a little, did Ethan allow himself to lean back against the wall. His body ached with exhaustion, but it was the emotional weight pressing hardest. The raw echo of seeing the puppies trussed up like discarded trash. It reminded him of the night he lost Private Halloran, the youngest soldier in his unit, barely 19, freckles still on his cheeks. Halloran had been trapped under twisted metal after the convoy exploded. Ethan had tried pulling him free, but frost in the Afghan mountains had already numbed the boy's legs. The memory hit like a sudden blow. Ethan clenched his jaw, forcing the ghost back. Tonight, at least, he had saved someone. 2 someones. Max lifted his head again, his dark brown eyes shining in the firelight. There was something fearless in that gaze, small but unbroken. Ethan stroked the puppy's head. "Max," he said softly, choosing the name because courage deserved to be acknowledged. The puppy nudged his hand, as if accepting the title. Luna stretched one paw, barely grazing Ethan's wrist. Her eyes fluttered open, soft, unsure, but alive. Her fur glowed faintly where the firelight touched the pale patch on her chest, like a tiny crescent moon. "Luna," he whispered, "you're my little moon." He wasn't a man given to sentiment. War hardened him, hollowed him, taught him that attachment meant loss. But tonight, something in him softened. Maybe it was the way Max leaned against Luna, guarding her even while weak. Maybe it was the way Luna kept breathing, despite having every reason to stop. Or maybe it was Grace Miller's voice echoing faintly in his mind. Gentle, steady, believing in things unseen. Grace, the blind young woman who had heard what the world ignored. He could still picture her delicate face framed by chestnut hair, her unseeing eyes searching the air, her white cane tapping like a heartbeat in the snow. Her presence in the alley felt like some quiet kind of intervention. She had appeared without fear, without hesitation, guided only by compassion. Ethan wondered how someone who spent her life in darkness could radiate so much light. He pulled the blanket around Max and Luna one more time, ensuring no draft slipped in. The fire's warmth deepened, painting their tiny forms in gold. Max laid his head on Luna's side. Luna, stronger now, nudged closer. Ethan watched them for a long while, listening to the wind and the faint, fragile breaths of 2 beings who refused to give up. Somewhere between the crackle of wood and the soft exhale of sleeping puppies, Ethan felt something in him shift. Not fully, not loudly, just enough. Enough for the storm inside him to loosen its grip for the first time in years. By midnight, Max and Tao, Luna had fallen into a fragile but peaceful sleep. Ethan sat upright, back against the wooden wall, the fire cradling the shadows around him. His eyes grew heavy, but he didn't move. He stayed beside them, guarding their breaths the way he once guarded men in uniform. Outside, snow kept falling, cold, relentless. But inside the cabin, surrounded by warmth, flickering firelight, and two tiny heartbeats, Ethan Cole felt himself inching from darkness towards something almost like hope. Morning light crept reluctantly over Denver, faint and silver, the kind of winter sun that only softened the cold rather than warming it. Snow still blanketed the roads, though plows had carved narrow paths through the drifts. Ethan Cole packed Max and Luna into his battered pickup truck, wrapping them carefully in thick towels warmed by the cabin's fire. Max was more responsive now, his brown eyes alert but guarded. Luna remained fragile, her tiny breaths uneven. The drive into the city was slow, the tires crunching through slush and ice. Ethan's fingers tightened on the steering wheel as he approached Denver Pet Care, a modest clinic with a faded red brick exterior. Its old wooden sign swayed listlessly in the wind. Inside the glass door stood Dr. Laura Bennett, a veterinarian in her mid-40s. She possessed a quiet authority, tall, with a narrow frame, ash-blonde hair tied in a loose bun, and pale freckles scattered across her fair skin. Her eyes were a warm hazel, touched by a softness that came from decades of tending to creatures who couldn't tell her where it hurt. She wore navy scrubs under a forest green cardigan, and the moment Ethan stepped in, she lifted her head sharply, sensing urgency before he spoke. "What happened?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Ethan set the bundled puppies on the metal examination table. "Found them last night, bound and gagged, hanging from a dumpster handle." Dr. Bennett's jaw tightened, not in shock, but in anger tempered by experience. "Cruelty is something I never get used to," she murmured. She slipped on gloves and began examining Max first. Her movements were efficient, yet gentle, as though touching something sacred. "Severe malnutrition," she said softly. "Mild hypothermia, but he's got fight in him." Then she lifted Luna, so carefully it felt like she was holding a wounded bird. "She's worse," Laura breathed. "If you hadn't found her..." Ethan nodded once, unable to speak. "They'll need warmth, scheduled feeding, hydration support," she continued. "And they must come back in 2 days. This isn't over yet." As Laura prepared vitamin injections, the side door opened with a soft chime, and Grace Miller stepped in from the adjoining rescue center. Her white cane tapped lightly across the floor, echoing like a heartbeat. She wore a long ivory coat and a knitted burgundy scarf, her chestnut hair braided loosely over one shoulder. Though blind since childhood, she carried herself with calm certainty, her movements guided by instinct rather than fear. "I heard tiny heartbreaks from across the hall," Grace said with a small smile, approaching the table. She knelt, hands hovering before gently finding Max's head and then Luna's chest. "They're warmer today," she whispered. "They know they're safe." Ethan watched her fingers trace Luna's ribs, as if reading a story through touch alone. Laura observed from across the room, her expression softening. She'd known Grace for years, and often said the young woman had the ears of a saint and the heart of a mother to anything abandoned. "You plan to surrender them to the center?" Laura asked casually, though she already suspected the answer. Ethan hesitated, looking at the two tiny bodies clinging to life. Max raised his head, meeting Ethan's eyes with surprising trust. Luna, weaker, pressed her small paw against his wrist. "No," Ethan said quietly. "They stay with me." Grace's smile widened. "They chose you already." Something unspoken passed between them, a gentle spark, warm as the fire that had saved the pups the night before. Ethan wasn't used to warmth, not emotional warmth, not human connection. But standing beside Grace, he felt its edges again. Somewhere across Denver, however, another day was beginning in the opposite direction. Jack Turner sat hunched on a sagging mattress in a rundown motel room off Colfax Avenue, the kind of place where peeling wallpaper outnumbered guests. Jack was 53, with a gaunt face carved by years of regret. graying stubble, and restless eyes that never seemed to settle. His once broad shoulders had sagged with time and drink. He had worked construction until an accident shattered his left knee and left him with a limp and a habit of numbing pain with cheap whiskey. On the small television perched on a crate, a local news report played. A local veteran rescued 2 German Shepherd puppies found bound and left in freezing conditions behind a grocery store. The screen showed a grainy photo someone had taken of Ethan carrying the pups through the snow. Jack's breath hitched. He knew that alley. He knew those puppies. He had found them weeks ago, strays born behind the dumpsters where he scavenged for cans. He had fed them scraps at first, talked to them even. But last night, when temperatures plunged and his pockets were empty, and the bottle had drained his sense of responsibility, he told himself, he couldn't do it anymore. He tied them, gagged them, hung them where someone might find them, telling himself it was mercy, not cowardice. But now, watching the news, he saw the truth laid bare. He hadn't abandoned the puppies. He had abandoned the last good part of himself. Jack turned off the TV and buried his face in his trembling hands. Shame burned deeper than the alcohol ever had. Outside the motel window, the sun struggled weakly against the gray sky, illuminating the snow-covered roofs. Something inside Jack, something bruised but not yet dead, stirred with restless guilt. He didn't know yet how or when, but he felt a pull toward the alley, the clinic, the man in the green coat who had done what he could not. Back at the veterinary clinic, Ethan held Max and Luna close after their injections. Grace stood beside him, her hand brushing the air until it found Max's ear. "Come back tomorrow?" she asked softly. "They'll want Pushel to hear your voice again." Ethan swallowed, his throat tight. "Yeah, I'll be back." Outside, the winter wind howled down the street, but for a brief moment, the world felt warmer for all 4 of them. And none yet knew that another pair of footsteps, haunted, hesitant, was slowly being drawn toward their lives. Night fell over Denver, with a heaviness that felt almost sentient, as if the city itself braced for what was coming. A second blizzard rolled down from the mountains, swallowing the horizon beneath a wall of white. Wind slammed against the windows of Ethan's small wooden cabin, rattling the glass until it hummed like a warning. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth struggled to stay alive, its light flickering across the worn floorboards. Max and Luna curled close together, their small bodies rising and falling in uneasy breaths, sensing tension in the air long before humans did. When the lamps flickered once, twice, and died with a soft sigh, the cabin plunged into a warm-colored darkness ruled only by firelight. Ethan exhaled sharply. He knew what that meant. If the temperature dropped any further, the puppies, still fragile despite their short recovery, could slip backward into danger. With an instinct born of years in combat rather than calm civilian life, he grabbed his faded green coat from the peg near the door, shoved his feet into snow-crusted boots, and stepped outside. The blizzard hit him like a wall. Wind carved at his skin, the cold slicing through the layers of fabric as though he wore nothing at all. Snow whipped violently around him, clinging to his shoulders, blinding his vision. He staggered toward the back of the cabin, where an old generator sat beneath a leaning shed. The machine was rusted, dented, and stubborn, but it had saved him through previous winters. Tonight, however, the storm had teeth. Ethan yanked the frozen cover open, breath steaming into the air. The fuel line was solid ice. The exhaust pipe clumped with frost. The engine coughed once when he tried the starter, then went silent. He knelt in the snow, his fingers numbing so quickly he didn't feel the cold at first. Just pressure, then nothing at all. He scraped at the ice around the intake, but the storm howled louder, and dizziness swept over him. His heart began to thud sluggishly. His breath came in short, painful bursts. A decorated soldier, trained through fire and war, brought to his knees not by bullets, but by cold and time. The irony tasted bitter. Ethan gripped the edge of the generator to pull himself up, but his boots slipped on snow. He fell, the impact sharp, stealing the air from his lungs. He tried again. His limbs refused. 30 steps from the cabin, yet suddenly it felt a world away. He sank slowly into the drifts, the snow rising like a blanket around him. Inside the cabin, Grace Miller sat on a small stool near the fire, listening to the way the wind scraped the chimney. It didn't sound right. Too violent. Too empty. She couldn't see the darkness inching closer, but she felt it. Max and Luna felt it too. The puppies suddenly bolted to the door, barking sharply, their paws skittering on the wooden floor. Grace straightened, her fingertips pressing gently into the rug to gauge direction. "What is it?" she whispered, already knowing the answer. The pups barked louder, circling her anxiously. Luna whined, nudging the bottom of the door with frantic paws. Grace's heart lurched. She stood, gripping her white cane in one hand. The door groaned against the wind as she pushed it open, the storm slamming icy air into her face. She shivered, but listened, really listened. Snow crunching, a faint, distant sound, a shape collapsing. "Ethan," she swallowed hard. "Go," she urged the pups. "Find him." Max and Luna shot into the storm, tiny bodies disappearing into the white chaos. Grace followed their barks, tapping cautiously across the snow-packed ground. The cold bit cruelly at her skin, but she moved with a fierce, trembling determination. The world was nothing but howling wind, and yet she felt it. The wrongness in the air. Her cane brushed against something soft. Cloth. A shoulder buried under snow. "Ethan!" She fell to her knees, her hands skimming over his face. Ice-crusted beard, frozen skin, lips cold as stone. Panic punched through her chest, but she steadied herself. "You stay with me. Do you hear me?" Max and Luna pressed themselves against Ethan's body, shaking but refusing to move. Their warmth was small but desperate, their loyalty as fierce as any battle-forged soldier. Grace wrapped her arms around Ethan, pulling with everything she had. Inch by inch, guided by memory rather than sight, she dragged him back toward the faint glow of the cabin window. Inside, she pushed the door shut with her shoulder, gasping for breath. She stripped Ethan's frozen coat off, covered him with heavy blankets, and guided the pups to lie directly across his chest, arms, and legs. Max curled over his heart. Luna across his ribs. Their small bodies radiated heat like living embers. Grace placed both her hands on Ethan's icy cheeks. "You saved them," she whispered. "Now let them save you." When Ethan next opened his eyes, the world was white. Not snow, hospital lights. The sterile scent of antiseptic floated around him. He blinked, heart pounding, until he saw Grace sitting beside the bed, her hand wrapped around his. "You're awake," she breathed. Dr. Laura Bennett appeared at the foot of the bed, hair tied back, exhaustion softened by relief. "You're lucky," she said firmly. "Another 10 minutes out there and—" She didn't finish. "Those 2 pups did half the work. They never left your side." Ethan exhaled shakily. Max and Luna, his little survivors. The door creaked. A man stood in the threshold, clutching a worn cap with trembling hands. Jack Turner looked smaller than his 50-plus years, shoulders rounded, eyes rimmed red, his rough face carved with guilt deeper than any line of age. "It was me," Jack choked out. "I'm the one who left them. I was drunk, stupid, wrong. I want to fix it. Build them a kennel. Work for the rescue center. Anything. Just let me make this right." Ethan stared at the man's broken expression, a man collapsing under the weight of his own conscience. Memories of fallen soldiers and the faces he couldn't save surged through him like a tide. Regret, sorrow, forgiveness. He inhaled slowly. "Anyone can lose their way," he said quietly. "What matters is whether you choose a different road after." Jack's breath broke. Grace squeezed Ethan's hand, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt the first flicker of forgiveness, not for Jack, but for himself. Spring crept slowly into Denver, melting the last patches of stubborn snow that clung to rooftops and quiet streets. Behind Ethan Cole's small wooden cabin, the once empty yard had transformed into something unrecognizable, a place of purpose. Wooden fences stood sturdy and straight, each plank sanded and sealed. Newly built kennels lined the outer edge of the property, their roofs angled to catch morning light. A carved wooden sign hung at the gate, its edges smoothed meticulously by hand. "Faithful Paws, where every soul gets another chance." Ethan stood in the yard in the early morning chill, his faded green coat unbuttoned, the breeze brushing past the scars on his knuckles. He was no longer a man running from Denver. The deep grooves in his face, once hardened by war, now softened whenever Max and Luna bounded across the yard. The two German shepherds, no longer the fragile one-month-old pups he had rescued, had grown into strong, confident young dogs, nearly a year old now, with glossy black and tan coats and sharp, intelligent eyes. Max's build was broader, his chest filled out with protective confidence, while Luna, slightly smaller, moved with a gentle grace and quiet alertness. Jack Turner worked on a kennel door nearby, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool weather. Months of effort had reshaped him. His once gaunt frame had filled out with muscle from labor, and though gray still streaked his unkempt beard, his eyes no longer held the hollow, hopeless stare of a man drowning. Now they reflected something steadier: gratitude. Redemption had not come to him easily, but it came all the same. He hammered a nail into place and grunted in satisfaction, nodding at his own work. He still carried guilt, but he carried it alongside purpose, not despair. Grace Miller stepped outside from the cabin, her white cane tapping lightly on the wooden porch. She wore a soft wool sweater and simple dark jeans, her long chestnut hair tied in a low braid. Denver sunlight illuminated the faint freckles across her pale cheeks. Though blind, she moved with practiced confidence, turning her head as though she could feel each sound forming in the air. To Ethan, Grace had become the quiet center of Faithful Paws, the one who listened to more than just words. She could hear a frightened dog's heartbeat from across the yard, recognize footsteps by their rhythm, and offer comfort with nothing more than a steady hand. Dr. Laura Bennett arrived shortly after, parking her aging Subaru by the fence. She stepped out carrying a crate of medical supplies, her ash-blonde hair pulled into a neat clip. Her tall, slender frame moved with the assurance of someone who had spent half her life caring for creatures in pain. Laura had a softness built from years of heartbreak, animals she couldn't save, cruelty she couldn't undo, but she let none of it slow her hands. Instead, she used their memory as fuel to keep tending to the wounded. "Morning," Laura called. "Ready for the chaos?" "As ready as we'll ever be," Ethan replied. Today was Adoption Day, their first official event. Residents from all over Denver, lonely retirees, widows, veterans hopeful for companionship, families needing a spark of joy, gathered near the gate. Some leaned on canes, some clutched coats against the cold. Little footsteps crunched the gravel as a boy with sandy hair tugged his father's sleeve, pointing at Max and Luna. A woman in her 70s smiled warmly as Grace greeted her by name, recognizing her voice from the rescue center. Ethan stepped onto the small wooden porch. Max and Luna flanked him, tails wagging, not wildly, but with that dignified confidence German shepherds carried when they sensed something important. He cleared his throat. Dozens of eyes lifted. Even Grace tilted her head toward his voice. "I used to think I saved 2 puppies," Ethan began, his voice steady, but threaded with emotion. But the truth is, they saved me. The yard fell into a hush, the kind that comes when people recognize truth shaped by pain. I carried war with me long after I left it, thought I'd never shake it off. But these two, he placed a hand on Max's head, then Luna's, they pulled me back. They reminded me how to care, how to feel, how to build something again. Max pressed against his leg. Luna nudged his boot gently. Ethan continued. Faithful Paws wasn't built by one man. Grace brought us heart. Laura brought us healing. Jack brought us courage. The courage to face our worst selves and start again. Jack looked down at his shoes, blinking hard. A soft ripple of emotion brushed the crowd. Quiet sniffles, gentle smiles, a veteran saluting with trembling fingers. Then the yard burst into warm movement. Dogs barked joyously. People crouched to pet trembling rescues. Papers rustled as adoption forms were filled. One by one, lost souls found homes. Grace knelt beside a timid terrier, her hand barely touching its fur. You'll find your person today, she whispered. Jack carried a crate for an elderly woman, steadying her arm when she slipped. Dr. Laura balanced between examining two dogs, her voice calm and encouraging as always. Ethan stood on the porch, his breath forming pale clouds in the cold air. Max and Luna sat on either side, watching the scene with regal attentiveness. For the first time since the war, Ethan felt whole. Not because the world was perfect, but because this little corner of it, this yard filled with barking and laughter and second chances, finally felt like home. Near the entrance, the carved sign gleamed softly in the winter sun. No soul left behind. And beneath it, a blind girl, a wounded veteran, a redeemed man, and two once-doomed puppies rewrote the meaning of the word family. In the quiet glow of faithful paws, where forgotten lives found warmth again, one truth shone brighter than the winter sun. Miracles rarely arrive with thunder. More often, they come softly, wrapped in fur, carried in trembling paws, whispered through the hearts of ordinary people who choose kindness over fear, compassion over silence. Ethan, Grace, Jack, Max, and Luna remind us that God's work is not always loud. Sometimes his miracles walk on four legs. Sometimes they appear in the form of forgiveness, unexpected friendships, or the courage to start again after being broken. And sometimes, they simply ask us to notice the small light in front of us and follow it home. As you return to your daily life, your routines, your challenges, your private storms, remember this. No soul is ever truly lost when love still has a path to reach it. And even on the coldest days, God sends warmth in the most unexpected ways. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these small miracles travel. And if you believe that God still moves quietly through the world, working through people, animals, and moments of grace, subscribe to the channel for more stories that heal, inspire, and remind us that we are never alone. May God bless you, your family, and every fragile soul still waiting for a little miracle of their own. Amen.